The election of 1968 was really something. We saw the return of President Richard Nixon, who was thought to have been dead politically after losing the 1962 governor election. We also saw the assassination of Martin Luther King, and then later LBJ surprising everybody by dropping out and not running for another term. And we also saw Robert F. Kennedy bring back some of the Kennedy magic from the dead in his 1968 campaign, though ultimately this too was cut short with RFK's assassination. And then ultimately, the Democrats ended up with one of the most boring candidates in American history, in Hubert Humphrey, who still ultimately almost won. And then there was, of course, the Dixiecrat George Wallace, who ran a third party candidate with the American Independent Party, hoping to deadlock the House of Representatives and then use his position as a kingmaker to end desegregation and civil rights. So, this election, while already incredibly interesting and incredibly exciting, would have been a lot more exciting had Bobby Kennedy not been assassinated and had he won the Democratic Party nomination. Bobby Kennedy was very well on track to win the Democratic Party nomination after a knockout win in the state of California in its primary there. However, this was, of course, cut short due to his assassination. I have my doubts as to whether Kennedy would actually win the nomination, considering how the LBJ machine was strongly against him. However, it is still very likely that Bobby Kennedy had a really good shot of winning the convention, just how JFK did in 1960, and I do believe he could have pulled it off in an underdog win. I believe that RFK's vice presidential candidate would be Terry Sanford. He was the governor of North Carolina, and despite being a Southerner who has had electoral success, he was actually quite good friends with the Kennedys, having endorsed John F. Kennedy in 1960 during the primary, and even being one of the few Southern governors to support desegregation. Terry Sanford would definitely be a top choice for RFK's vice presidential pick, and even though he did endorse Hubert Humphrey this race, I think it would be better actually if Humphrey picked him, considering how this would bring unity to the fractured Democratic Party, considering how chaotic the 1968 convention was. Back in the 1960s, there were a lot more swing states than there were today. In fact, every single state that you see not colored in here would be considered a swing state in this new 1968 election. Texas would be considered an easy win for Richard Nixon, especially considering how Hubert Humphrey was backed by the LBJ machine to a certain extent, but RFK Jr. or RFK would not be backed at all by the LBJ machine. In fact, I think LBJ would secretly, or maybe even not so secretly, try to help Nixon win the state of Texas, and the Texas Democratic Party would not help Kennedy whatsoever. Plus, there was plenty of anti-Catholic sentiment in Texas that didn't really go anywhere in 1960 due to Kennedy picking LBJ as his VP, but was a key reason why it went Democrat or why it went Republican for the first time in its state history in 1928 when Al Smith was running. So the combination of anti-Catholic sentiment as well as LBJ doing everything to sabotage RFK in the state would lead to Nixon easily winning the state of Texas, in my opinion. And the state of Maine, which is another state that Humphrey won in real life, would not be won by Kennedy or would not even be a swing state because the only reason Humphrey won it is because he chose a popular person from Maine as his vice president, and this is not something that RFK would do, so Maine would be solid red as well. So there you go. This is the map of all the swing states. And of course, some of these states wouldn't really be contestable by RFK, such as states like South Carolina, as well as Tennessee and Arkansas, which were really just contests between Wallace and Nixon. Now, to further narrow the swing states, I would say that the states which I have not colored would be the extremely competitive ones. States like California, New Mexico, Missouri, Illinois, Wisconsin, Ohio, North Carolina, Delaware, and New Jersey. North Carolina was not competitive for the Democrats in 1968 in real life, mostly because, again, Humphrey did not have the benefit of selecting a popular governor from that very state as his vice presidential pick. And I think the pick of Terry Sanford would help RFK very much in the state of North Carolina, especially among the more poor residents of eastern North Carolina who were going to vote for George Wallace in real life. They would now reconsider considering the presence of Terry Sanford. So there you have it. Overall, there would be this many swing states, one in the South, four in the Midwest, two on the Eastern Seaboard, and two in the West. I do believe that this election would not have a presidential debate because I think Nixon would not want to make the same mistake he did in 1960, and I don't think he would want to debate RFK. And initially, I do believe Nixon would have a strong lead in the polls because of just the chaos that went on in the DNC, as well as the fact that Democrats were very unpopular this year. I also think that due to LBJ's sabotaging of RFK, Vietnam peace talks would not go anywhere. In real life, there was a real effort by LBJ to do Vietnam peace right before the election, but this ultimately did not come to fruition because of Nixon sabotaging the deal to politically help himself. But anyways, I don't think LBJ would even make an attempt to attempt peace in Vietnam. I don't think he would even try to do so. In fact, I wouldn't even be surprised if LBJ escalated the war and made peace more impossible just to spite RFK. George Wallace would also be a massive thorn in the side of RFK, even though Nixon believed that Wallace was more so a thorn in his side because of the conservative split. Most of the voters who went to Wallace were ultimately white, blue-collar workers, rather than suburbanites, who mostly went to Nixon anyways. And the main voters who went to Wallace were socially conservative, white, blue-collar workers who would have gone for the Democrat in almost every other election, but were angry regarding civil rights. And this wasn't just the case in the South, but this happened in many northern states as well, such as Nevada, Idaho, and a lot of the Midwestern states, such as Wisconsin, Ohio, as well as Michigan. So Wallace would definitely be a thorn in RFK's side. So considering all the factors against RFK, it would seem like this would be an easy and almost unblowable election by Nixon. But knowing Nixon, that's just not how stuff goes. He almost lost 1968 despite going against a pretty weak Democratic candidate in Hubert Humphrey. So I think RFK would definitely do a really good job this election. And this is despite the rioting and the variety of factors against him. I think RFK's main assets in this election, which Hubert Humphrey did not have, would be high support among African American voters who actually trusted Kennedy more than any other white politician in America, as well as support among Hispanic and Latino voters. He would even gain the endorsement, I believe, of the United Farm Workers Association, led by Cesar Chavez, and this would help him immensely in states like California, New Mexico, and Nevada with higher Hispanic populations. Kennedy was even popular among white working class voters who seemed to resonate with him in a way that they did not with Hubert Humphrey or even his brother JFK. The one demographic group that I think RFK would be weak amongst would be suburban voters, who I think would go to Nixon in large flocks. But I believe that rural voters would be more competitive, and urban voters would go overwhelmingly to RFK with larger turnout numbers that we would see in real life in 1968 with Hubert Humphrey. Now let's go with each swing state and how they would have gone. I believe the state of New Jersey and the state of Delaware, the states on the eastern seaboard, one of them would go to Nixon and one would go to Kennedy. The state of New Jersey would go to Nixon mostly because of how it's designed as essentially a suburb of New York, and Kennedy himself was not very good in the suburbs. There weren't a lot of minority voters in New Jersey, unlike other states, and I think the very suburban nature of the state would allow Nixon to win it. In the state of Delaware, I do believe RFK would actually win this state, mostly because of high black populations in Wilmington, much younger voters, a much more diverse population. I believe RFK would win the state of Delaware, while Nixon would win New Jersey. This would lead to an electoral map that would look like this. Next up, we have the state of Ohio and the state of Wisconsin. I believe Richard Nixon would win both of these states. Both of these states didn't have a ton of racial diversity, although they were much more working class than New Jersey and Delaware, which I do believe would make them more competitive for RFK. But at the same time, the lack of racial diversity, as well as the fact that many blue-collar workers in the Midwest were more inclined towards George Wallace, I do believe that both of these states would ultimately go to Nixon due to a lack of high blue collar support for RFK. Although it would still be higher than Humphrey's, it wouldn't be high enough, I believe, for RFK to win these two states. So there you go. Nixon would be at 233, RFK would be at 165, and George Wallace would be at 45. Next up, the state of North Carolina. I believe that the presence of Terry Sanford would lead to RFK winning the state. RFK would gain a lot more votes in northeastern North Carolina, a part of the state which George Wallace won overwhelmingly in 1968. The presence of Terry Sanford would cause many more of these poorer white voters to vote for RFK instead of going for George Wallace. And then the states of Missouri and Illinois. I believe both of these states would also go towards RFK. Similar to North Carolina, these states are a lot more racially diverse compared to Ohio and Wisconsin, and high black turnout in cities like St. Louis and Chicago, as well as just Democratic machines in these two states, would ultimately lead to, I believe, RFK winning the two of them. So now we have a very tight race with Nixon at 233 and RFK at 216, and the states of California and New Mexico being the two remaining swing states. If Nixon just wins California, he wins the election. In the state of New Mexico, as well as the state of Nevada, Nevada did have potential to be a swing state this election, but I don't believe it would have been, mostly because of the fact that despite having a high Hispanic population, the presence of George Wallace on the ballot would have hurt Humphrey, or would have hurt RFK among rural white working class voters in the northern parts of the state. And the main reason why George Wallace had such a high percentage of votes in Nevada, and more so than any other northern state, was because of the endorsement of Nevada's only congressman at the time, who was essentially a Dixiecrat. And then in the state of New Mexico, I believe that RFK would actually win this state, mostly because despite Nixon winning it overwhelmingly in real life, the high Latino vote turnout, as well as the support of the United Farm Workers, would I believe help RFK get over the hump here. So now we have Nixon at 233, RFK at 220, and just the state of California left. If Nixon wins the state, he wins the election. And unfortunately for Richard Nixon, I do believe the state of California would go to RFK. While JFK did lose the state in 1960, keep in mind that RFK would have almost gotten assassinated here in this alternate scenario, and similar to how the assassination attempt of Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania, really helped Trump in that area of Pennsylvania, I think the attempted assassination of RFK in Los Angeles would help RFK immensely in Southern California, plus high Latino turnout for RFK, as well as high black turnout for RFK in more diverse cities such as Los Angeles, as well as the more rural Hispanic parts of the state, would ultimately lead to RFK getting over the hump here due to a lot of Hispanic as well as African American vote support. And I do think this would be the closest state in the election. This would probably be recounted like a million times, but I think RFK would ultimately win California. So with that, we have RFK at 260 electoral votes, Nixon at 233, and George Wallace at 45. But there's a problem. No candidate has a majority of electoral votes, which would send the election to the House of Representatives and would only please one man, the segregationist George Wallace himself. With the election being sent to the House of Representatives, Wallace would finally have the chance to be a kingmaker and potentially be the biggest hero ever for the Dixiecrats and racists in the South who wanted to end civil rights. Ultimately, this was the composition of Congress at the time regarding each delegation. Democrats had control of 27. There were 5 mixed delegations, and Republicans had control of 18. In real life, Republicans had control of New Mexico, but I think RFK's strong performance there would allow Democrats to retain their House seats there and thus get the delegation. I think factoring in the Dixiecrats, though, I believe Wallace would ultimately win the delegations of 6 states in the first round of voting, being South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas, the Deep South states. I think Upper South states like North Carolina would go to RFK due to the presence of Terry Sanford. Tennessee also was much more racially moderate than these Deep South states. Same with Florida and Texas, where I don't think LBJ would really want to make it too obvious that he's handing the White House to Nixon. So I think Texas would vote for RFK, its delegation there. But ultimately, neither candidate has gotten to 26, so there would be deadlock. Now, at first glance, you would instantly think that Nixon would be the one to cave to the Dixiecrats and ultimately give in to ending desegregation, but it isn't that simple. Even though I think Strom Thurmond would ultimately lead to South Carolina's delegation backing Nixon, I think at the same time, though, the presence of more moderate Republicans would prevent Nixon from doing this. And if Nixon did ultimately cave into the Dixiecrats, I do believe that the northern, more moderate Republicans would have either voted present or would have outright voted for RFK to give him the majority. And ultimately, this just goes down to who has more connections between Nixon and RFK. And we both know the answer as to who has the superiority regarding connections, and it is by no means Richard Nixon. So, with RFK's political connections in Congress, I do believe the South would eventually break its deadlock, or just some Northern moderates would eventually just vote present to give RFK the keys to the White House. And I think after months of deadlock, RFK would finally be elected President of the United States. And ultimately, Richard Nixon would be politically dead, and he would again say to reporters, "You won't have Nixon anymore to kick around." So anyways, guys, thanks so much for watching this video. Make sure to like this video down below and subscribe to the channel. Mr. US History, out.